Hello, everyone, and welcome to Musing, music for the adventurous listener here on CJSW 90.9 FM. I'm your host, Janna Sailor. On today's episode, I'm in conversation with Dutch accordion virtuoso Erica Roozendaal. Currently based in The Hague, Erica sees herself primarily as a storyteller, expressing a narrative, experience, or emotion, using the accordion as the medium that best serves that purpose. Erica is passionate about creating new timbres, images, and stories that touch the listener and challenge the audience, and her performances mainly focus on early music, contemporary, and improvised music. She works extensively with composers, which has resulted in dozens of solo pieces and chamber works. Let's listen in to the accordion in the hands of Erica Roozendaal. Erica, such a pleasure to have you in conversation with me today on Musing. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me as well.
So for folks that have yet to encounter your music and your artistry, how do you describe your work and your identity as an artist?
Well, first of all, I play the accordion. So I'm a musician mainly. I like to paint and to tell stories as well. So for me, making art is about telling a story. And I use the vessel, which is best for whatever I would like to say. But I play accordion as that's my best skill. So music is always involved.
And what drew you to the accordion specifically? As I love how you say your vessel of expression.
I was a child and I grew up in a small village and we had a music school. At the time, all music schools in the Netherlands were still funded by the government. So you just went there. You start with recorder, and then I saw other instruments at the local music school. And actually, I wanted to play the piano, but I wasn't allowed because the piano is big and expensive for in my parents' living room. And then I saw this accordion, which was partly piano. It had colors and it sounded pretty nice. I think the sound is appealing when you're a child. So that's why I chose it. I think the way children choose based on some very concrete examples, but somehow I think you intuitively choose the instrument which really fits you.
And as a child, you have less filters and you just are drawn to what you're drawn to. So for us here in Canada, the accordion is very underrepresented, which was why I was extra excited to feature you on today's episode. I can only think of a handful of professional accordionists, incredible musicians, but not a lot of them. Can you tell us about the accordion scene and training schools in the Netherlands?
Well, I think as classical accordions, we have more of them. I can name a couple of handfuls. But still, people are surprised what you can do on the accordion. And the image is probably the same as in Canada, that it's a folk music instrument. And also the classical accordion is quite young. It started only after the Second World War. So there is still a long way, I would say. But when I go to Vancouver, I feel like I'm basically the only one who plays the accordion within the classical music scene. And that's not the case here in the Netherlands. I'm one of still not many, but quite a few. But that has changed over the last 2 decades. I think when I just started studying, I didn't study in the Netherlands because you couldn't. Whenever I would join a project, most people never worked with the accordion before. And that is almost never the case anymore. Yeah. So it's changing rapidly.
So we had the opportunity to work together at a wonderful festival in Vancouver. And I had the opportunity to take in one of your solo performances, which was, I still think of it as one of my favorite performances. And what I loved so much about it is how you seamlessly wove together contemporary works of prominent and Canadian composers with the works of Bach, like a prelude and fugue. And you did it so beautifully. And there was times when I was just closing my eyes and listening, and all of a sudden this was Bach. And then we were into another piece, but they just were woven together so beautifully and seamlessly. And you highlighted those works so exquisitely with the contrast of those numbers. How do you go about interpreting something like Bach, prelude and fugue, a very old and revered art form, on an instrument that, as you mentioned, is very new?
I really love learning about, the way people performed in Baroque era, as far as we know, or learn about klezmer music or any kind of specific type. But then I also like to apply it to my instrument and place it in my own context. I think, and I hope when you listen to my Bach that you can hear, it has, for example, dance elements, or you can hear the way they dealt with harmonies. But at the same time, of course, my instrument is a completely different sound to harpsichord. And I love emphasizing the differences as well. I mean, the sustaining notes, they can create harmonies you would never hear on a piano or a harpsichord. So I enjoy the differences as well. And I'm also not scared in, not being very dogmatic about rules, because I'm not always convinced that they don't always work in the context here and now. You know what I mean?
Sometimes there's such an interesting result that comes from knowing the rules, being informed by the rules and breaking them, or playing something that's very regimented and rule following, and then something that's very free.
Yeah, exactly. And the more you know, the more you can actually consciously choose what you want. So I think it only enriches the music you play.
Het daget in den oosten. Het ligt het overal. Hoe luttel weet mijn liefke nog waar ik henen zal. Och warend al mijn vrienden dat mijn vijanden zien. Ik voer uit een landen, mijn lief, mijn minnekin. Wat zwaar zou die mij voeren, stout ridder wel gemijd. Ik ligge in min's liefs armkens met grote waardigheid. Ligt hij in uws liefs armen, biologie en zegt niet waar. Gaat henen ter linde groene, want verslagen zo leidt hij daar. Het meisje nam haar een mantel en de zie ging ene gang. Al tot de linde groene, daar ziet ten dode wand. Ook ligt hij hier verslagen, versmoord al in uw bloed. Dat heeft gedaan uw roemen en de uwen hogen moet. Och ligt hij hier verslagen die mij te troosten plag. Wat heb die mij gelaten, zo menigen droeven dag. Het meisje nam haar een mantel en de zie ging ene gang. Al voor haars vaders poorten, die zie ontsloten wand. Och, is hier enig heren of enig edelman, die mijn doden begraven helpen kan?
part of what you do, and almost out of necessity, is working with contemporary composers that write for your instrument. Tell me about some of those collaborations and your experience of working with composers and constructing something specific to you and to your instrument.
For example, Farshid from Canada. We met a long time ago in the Netherlands. We met on the stairs in the Amsterdam Conservatory and we just had a chat. And he never heard the accordion, so he was very keen on writing for the instrument, and he did. I love working with composers who never worked with the instrument because they have to learn a lot, but then they have their own imagination as well, you know? So I also learn a lot from what is possible on my instrument. And I think we should all, working with composers who are living now, you know, it makes a lot of sense because it's what it is about. If you would only play old music, you might become a museum somehow. That's maybe a bit far-fetched, but I think it should be a natural part of what we do. Farshid's dance, he wrote a lot. He also wrote a piece for my trio, Roadrunner. He wrote a second accordion piece. And he wrote a concerto, of course, because you have been conducting it. And it's nice to see how his writing for the instrument develops as well. Yeah, the first piece was really like exploration of the instrument. So you can hear all the elements kind of showcasing in a way. But later on, we all find our own style. And that's what I feel is the case with his work as well. It's nice to see how that goes.
To see your instrument and the capabilities of it through someone else's lens, that must be so fascinating, and hear it reinvented each time with each piece.
Exactly, absolutely. And also, what I find very interesting is that I am sometimes too quick with saying what doesn't work or does. If something looks too pianistic, I tend to say, no, don't write like that. But then maybe I should always try it and see what comes out, because even though it looks like it's too much for another instrument, it works beautifully. So I also learned to never judge fast, always try out whatever they suggest, which I also find very interesting.
composer yourself, how do you go about composing for you?
I shouldn't say I'm not a composer. I'm a very bad writer. So I have my ideas, and when I can play it myself, it doesn't become very necessary to write things down. And then I write for my trio and I communicate with them. And then, things kind of grow. So it's more of organic process. True composers, they hand me scores. And I work with people, and then I have ideas and I write them down, and they have ideas and they come in the piece as well. I would say that all my pieces, I think they all start with just free improvisation. It's more like a fixed improvised part. Yeah, some of Bach's music works like that as well, I think.
And it eventually coalesces into a structure and a kind of a pattern that you can pick up on and repeat. One of your pieces called Hoag's Object that you wrote. Tell us about this piece.
Hoag's Object is based on, well, it's not really the sound, but you have data from universe. They pick up like waves. It's not sound waves because they don't arrive. And some of the data was from two black holes, like spinning around each other and then eventually colliding into some sort of super mega black hole. And well, on YouTube, you can listen recordings of how that would be sounding. And I thought it was a very fascinating sound. So that was the base of the piece.
For your trio, love the name Roadrunner Trio. Tell me about this ensemble and its makeup and kind of the concept of what you guys created together.
Well, it's together with Michel Marang on clarinet and Antonis Pratsinakis on cello. I met Michel about 10 years ago. I saw one of his performances and I was really positive about it. So I approached him and asked maybe if he wanted to make a duo, but he suggested to make a trio, and he knew a very good cellist as well. Yeah, so we came together and we talked about whatever we wanted to do. And it seemed nice to us to not just only play pieces, but to see the trio as some sort of workshop area to try out what we wanted to try out. So if one of us wanted to write a piece, well, we're there and we're gonna work on that. Or if you want to work with a contemporary composer, we do so. And we came to some sort of mix of written music and improvised, arranged folk music. So we play everything we want, but in the end it all sounds a bit like Roadrunner.
pieces incorporate some traditional, more folk-like elements. Can you tell me about that influence on your work and as being a musician living and working in the Netherlands?
Yeah, since I grew up with the accordion, I played only folk music as a child because that was the repertoire I knew at the time. Only later on I found out that you could play classical music on the instrument as well. So, yeah, it's somewhere in my roots. I just love simple melodies and beautiful harmonies. But then during my studies, at some point I was like, I want to pick up that part of me as well, simple tonal music, something I can be creative with. So I didn't know where to start, but I started playing a lot of klezmer because I had some klezmer musicians with whom I got along very well. And I wondered, what about our own folk music? I mean, I'm from the Netherlands, so we must have some music from the past. So I dived into old obscure literature and found melodies. But we don't have a tradition like in some other countries where, people pass on the music from generation to generation. So in the end, I wouldn't call it folk music because it hasn't been, I didn't learn it from my grandmother or so. But it's beautiful, simple melody, and I put chords underneath, and I basically feel like I have a green card to do whatever I want with it. You can learn from other folk instruments. It's an attitude, of course. And you must be willing to play by ear and to not have fixed notes, to make embellishments or revise and make variations. So it's not like there is no bass or whatsoever, but it's not in a specific style. And with my trio, it's the same. We arrange a lot and we make it our own.
You're also quite multifaceted in your work in that you collaborate with dancers and with theater productions. Tell me more about those less traditional, maybe more outside the box collaborations and projects.
Yeah, I love them because, doing another discipline also strengthens my music making. For example, in the beginning of this year, I worked with a dance company and I had to play a Goodbye Dulina, which I'd never done because I was just not so interested. And I felt like that music was too big for me. Like I felt I would have to put too much ego on stage. But then when I learned it, my opinion changed 180 degrees.
Extroverted music.
Very much like here I am, here I'm showing my possibilities or whatever I can do on the instrument. But then I found out that music is just a very collective experience together with the audience. And it's big and it's deep. But when I feel I can, expand my musical bubble like further away, so the audience is part of the whole music making. And that changed my perception so much with dancers. It's a dialogue you have with them as well. So yeah, that's just one example. And then I also wrote a play, a Nachts, which I performed in Canada as well on the Queer Arts Festival. It's called Night Owl, by the way, in English, which is storytelling combined with music and some of my paintings. It's very simple. I just tell my own story on stage, which I love doing as well. Also involving folk music together with my trio Roadrunner. We're having a project called Ports of Departures. We interview immigrants and we ask them why they immigrated and what they miss from home, how their travels were. But we also ask their musical story. So what music they miss or what sounds they miss. And then we use their inputs for a concert. So we're having a concert with music from all over the world. And also all different backgrounds. I mean, there's pop music, folk music, contemporary stuff. And we have no excuse as in, yeah, what they give is what we have. So even if some pieces are very difficult to arrange, but that makes it even more interesting.
folks experience your music and your presence on stage or listening to your albums, what do you hope that they take away from their encounter with your artistry?
I hope I leave, an open impression. Going to a concert, it's an experience with everybody together. So I hope they feel they connect. Connection is most important, I think, for me, and to touch people. I feel touched when I reach somebody for some reason, or when you feel like you're on some pattern. It's what we need as human beings. And, when I tell a story, it's words, which is sometimes needed. That's why I do it as well. But music is always abstract. I always used to think that music would be like my native language because I feel the least borders when I play, the most myself in terms of expressing. And I hope people feel that as well, and that it resonates and that it does something positive with them as well. I sometimes feel relieved when I listen to music, which I enjoy a lot.
Something to continue to come back to, like an old friend.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. It can be like that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. I think that's a good place to leave it with those sentiments in our thoughts. Thank you so much, Erica, for being my guest today on Musing.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
This is Musing on CJSW 90.9 FM in Calgary. I'm your host, Janna Sailor. Thanks so much for joining me for this celebration of music, creators, and ideas. Musing is a production of the Canadian Music Centre Prairie Region and is heard right here in Calgary and around the world. As we end our time together, we recognize that there are more than 630 First Nations communities across the land that we now know of as Canada, representing 50 distinct nations and Indigenous languages. In addition, there are Métis in every province of the country and 53 Inuit communities speaking different dialects of Inuktitut across the north. We acknowledge them as the original music makers, dancers, creators, and caretakers of our lands, and they continue to inspire and teach us as we commit to learning and moving forward together. I will leave you now with more music from accordion virtuoso Erica Roozendaal. Until next time, thanks for listening and for supporting musicians and creators in your community. Take care.
Stil. Verroer geen vin. Beweeg geen teen, verborgen kind. De wereld is gemeen. Stil. Wees stil. Want niemand mag je horen. Wees stil, verborgen kind. Je naam, je huis heb je verloren. Zorg dat men niet je lichaam vindt. Stil. Ze zou soms willen schreeuwen, stampen, gillen, bijten, trappen, slaan. Maar moet als lief, stil meisje, als ondergrondse mol, bijna onzichtbaar door het leven gaan. Stil. Blijf zitten waar je zit. Verroer je niet. Kijk door het raam naar buiten. En ga binnen desnoods heel, heel zacht een kinderliedje fluiten. slaapt. U uitverkoren bloemen, ook ligt in u en slaapt. In u en ieders dromen ontwekt u zoete lief. Wil door uw venster komen, staat op en wilt ontvaan. Den mij met Sinen bloemen.